All set? Okay. So, as most of you know, I gave a class on Saturday, which was very exciting, and I thank you all for making it a very intense and useful meeting for me as well as for you, I hope, which covered the political and economic side of things in the world today, and the focus of our work in the United States and internationally. So for Rita asked me to come today to discuss something I haven't discussed in about 12 years, which is the work I did when I was in prison for 10 years, from about 1989 till about 2000, where because I had a 77-year sentence, I decided I better take on a big subject, and a big subject is 5,000 years of Chinese history and philosophy. So I spent a good deal of my time studying that, reading that, and writing extensively about that. A number of articles in the Fidelio, some in the 21st Century Science, some in EIR, covering many aspects of Chinese history, Chinese politics, Chinese philosophy. Also work on the rest of Asia, but especially on the question of the history, the Chinese philosophic history and its relationship to the European Renaissance, which is what really caught my interest and my excitement and led me through that 10-year period of tremendous intellectual excitement, despite being locked up in a prison. So, as I discussed on Saturday, and I won't repeat it, I focused a lot on the fact that throughout history, from the beginning of modern recorded history anyway, the issue of the conflict between those people in Europe who recognized that building some sort of connection with Asia, uniting the Eurasian landmass, was essential if there was going to be progress in civilization generally. And the opposition to that, we need one more seat. Can we find one more? Do you want to, you got a spot for her to sit there? Yeah. Yeah, move it up front. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Thank you. Glad you're here.
When it's time, it starts at 7:30.
So, and in opposition to that effort to unite Eurasia is the actions of the oligarchy, the empire, the actions of the Venetian Empire, and then later, when it moved north to Venice and Holland, the British-Dutch Empire, to sabotage that kind of collaboration, that kind of land bridge connection between Europe and China, Europe and Asia, and Europe and the Middle East as well. So that fight, which the efforts by Charlemagne to link up Europe with the Arab world, which were then sabotaged by the Crusades, orchestrated by Venice for financial as well as strategic reasons, and the efforts by Nicholas of Kuza and Gottfried Leibniz to working with the Jesuits in China to bridge Europe and Russia, Peter the Great and China, in this kind of great development project for Eurasia to break the power of the British-Dutch Empire. That also sabotaged by Venice and the imperial interests, and then the efforts of Bismarck and the American system efforts in Europe to link up with the Middle East and Asia, that too sabotaged by the British in the launching of World War I, World War II, and the whole century of war in the 20th century. Today we have Lynn and Helga's work pretty much alone, with key allies here and there in Russia and the United States and in Europe, but really this effort alone can prevent the current very rapid rush for global warfare and the financial collapse of the Western banking system. And that's the urgency with which we held this conference in Frankfurt last week. We plan to hold another similar, last week, and then another conference in April, bringing together key people from Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the United States to address the absolute urgency of a paradigm shift in the world. And Helge has always made the point that this is not just an economic issue, it's not even just a cultural issue, but it's a paradigm shift of the way people think. And Lynn's focus on the fact that people think in terms of sense certainty. They think from the bottom up because that's the way the degrading of our educational system has made people think, while they introduce them to rock music and drugs and countercultural thinking. And reversing that is going to require a true renaissance in the way people think and what we know about our capacity to be creative and to act upon that. So today I'm going to talk about Confucianism. And like I said, it's been years since I've looked at this. I spent the afternoon quite joyfully reviewing some of the work I did so that it was a bit more fresh in my head. But I think it's a good question. I'm glad Farida asked, because, I mean, we are looking at the necessity of building this Eurasian Land Bridge concept, not just in Eurasia, actually for the whole world. But obviously the key nations here are Russia and China, and to some extent India. And we know a lot about Russia. We're on the verge of war with Russia, but we're also working with the Russians on things like building the tunnel under the Bering Strait, on countering this collapsed Western financial and political system. And there's less known about China, and I think I'm not going to try to discuss the current Chinese situation, but I'm just going to go ahead and plow into a discussion of Chinese philosophy and Chinese history. And I think you'll see that the way I approached this was the way that Gottfried Leibniz approached it, which was to see the comparison between Chinese and the European Renaissance, Christian Renaissance thinking. And in doing it that way, I think you'll see that we have every reason to be optimistic that we can break the divide between Europe and Asia and build the kind of alliance that's necessary to win. I'll just start by referencing something I said Saturday, which was that at the point at which Gottfried Leibniz, who was this is in the 16 and 1700s, was working closely with the Jesuits who had gone into China and who discovered, really, that there was this great 5,000-year-old culture that was far more advanced than anything in Europe, at least before the Renaissance. And were quite astonished to find that the Confucian thinking was very much in sync with the Christian thinking in the West. And Leibniz himself, in reading Confucius and Mencius and the Sung dynasty, that's the 12th century, Renaissance in China, was extremely excited about that concept. And I read this quote on Saturday. I'll read a longer quote, which is the same quote, only expanded, to give you a flavor of that. Here's what Leibniz had to say about Confucianism after he'd studied it. He said, in Confucianism, to offend heaven is to act against reason. To ask pardon of heaven is to reform oneself and to make a sincere return in work and deed in the submission one owes to this very law of reason. For me, I find this all quite excellent and quite in accord with natural theology. Only by strained interpretation and interpolation could one find anything to criticize in this point. It is pure Christianity, insofar as it renews the natural law which is inscribed in our hearts, except for what revelation and grace add to it to improve our nature. And it's this concept of the idea that the truth is inscribed in our hearts, that there's human beings are distinguished from the beasts precisely by the fact that we have in us the potential for great creative discovery, and that the truths of the universe, the universal principles in the universe, are there for us to access if we choose to act like human beings and not to act like animals. That's why I wish your sister was here. I'm going to skip now that particular moment of tremendous potential of linking up Eurasia, and Leibniz was working with Peter the Great in Russia at that time, so the potential for a tremendous transformation to break the power of empire was there. It was broken in something I guess I won't go through too much today, but through what they called the rights controversy, where a corrupt pope, it was Clement the 11th, by the way, somebody asked the other day, to issue a papal bull saying that what Leibniz said here, that Confucianism is pure Christianity, was not true, that you could not be a Christian and a Confucian at the same time, that anybody who wished to become a Christian had to refute Confucianism, had to stomp on the tablets, so-called, the tablets of their ancestors that they used in their what they called worship of their ancestors. It wasn't worship, it was paying respect to the ancestors. And that this, because Confucianism had become much more than the philosophy of the Chinese people, but it was actually the code and conduct of their government. And then to renounce Confucianism was basically to say you renounce the government. And so what had been a wide open situation for collaboration between the Chinese Kangxi Emperor and the West on science, on technology, on music, on religion, instead was crushed by the Venetians, who sabotaged it through the Vatican, and the tie was broken. The Chinese tended to turn in on themselves, ended up decaying to a great extent, and about 100 years later the British showed up with their gunboats and their opium. And the hell of the last 2 centuries was unleashed. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk a bit. You just took my pen. Can I have one? Is there a problem with the pen? There is.
You don't have to use it.
She's a
I'll
pen
hide it.
snatcher.
There's a problem since the Chinese today, Confucianism, that's something old hat from.
Well, that's a long story and a very interesting question, but I don't have time to go into that. But maybe we can when I finish going through what I want to go through, because there is a revival of Confucianism. Confucianism was denounced and attacked by Mao during the Cultural Revolution. Very complex but fascinating story. But there's a revival of this today because many people in China recognize that this is not a question of religion or non-religion. It's a question of belief in the good.
Yeah.
So hopefully you'll get a sense of that from what I go through. So let's just start. What is Confucianism? One of the first things I wrote was called "Christians Must Know What Confucius Said." And the sort of common image of the Chinese Empire is that you had this emperor who was all-powerful and usually a vile, evil character imposing dictatorial policies on the masses of the Chinese and so forth. The Confucian idea, and he was up against an opposite policy called the Legalists, which I'll discuss, but the Confucian policy, which increasingly became the dominant mode of thinking or philosophy of the Chinese people and the Chinese government, was focused on a concept which Confucius wrote about in his discourses, which came actually from an ancient even at that time, philosopher, which said that if there shall be distress and want within the empire, then the mandate of heaven shall be taken away from you forever. The mandate of heaven being the mandate of the emperor, which sounds like it's, I'm like a god or something. But the fact is it's a mandate from the gods or from heaven, which an emperor must live up to. It's not his absolute power, but rather if there is distress and poverty in the empire, then he shall lose that mandate of heaven. That is the responsibility of the emperor, is to live up to his responsibility to serve the people. which is really in the West wasn't something that we even had until the time of the Peace of Westphalia. But from the beginning of the Chinese culture, that concept was embedded in the Confucian ideology. I wanted to look at this next. 46. So this mandate was based on a concept of what was known as Ren, R-E-N or J-E-N. Where in the world was 46? Oh, this one here. Which is the idea of it. Ren is a concept which means love in a sense, but it actually means something more than love. It's more like the word that we think of as agape. What would you say in Danish so people know what?
Kristen næstekærlighed.
Okay. It's more than love. It's more like the love of mankind or the love of truth or the love of God, a higher form of love, which subsumes the love between people, but it is a higher form. It's a concept of a love really of the creation. And it's this idea in Confucianism which gave rise to this idea of the mandate of heaven. The emperor had to live according to Ren, sometimes spelled J-E-N because it's pronounced sort of Ren, but that's the term. It sometimes is translated as benevolence. What would that be in Danish? Benevolence, goodness, the quality of goodness and of kindness or something. But it actually means this higher kind of love. It was part of what was known as the four key qualities that constitute virtue, which were benevolence or Ren, this idea of agape, along with righteousness, propriety, and knowledge. Propriety sometimes is known as the rights, and it's sometimes reduced to just acting properly and acting according to tradition and your stature. The rights, propriety. All of these make up virtue. It's these four qualities, but Ren is the most important, and it's the sort of dominating idea of the whole history of Chinese culture. Now, explicitly opposed to this, and in fact it formed as a reaction to Confucius, and it was contemporary with the key follower of Confucius, who was Mencius, about 150 years later. And Mencius, if you ever want to read this stuff yourself, I would suggest it's worth reading Confucius, but reading Mencius is very exciting. He was up against all of the reactions, more of the backward cults, not just the Taoists who were always a problem, but also especially this legalist culture that was created by oligarchs in order to counter this concept of the Confucian benevolent society. I'll read you a couple of things on that, if I can find them. First of all, here's what is said about Ren, or benevolence. Benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and knowledge are not infused into us from without. We are certainly furnished with them. These are born in us. That's what makes us distinguished from the animal. A different view is simply owing to a want of reflection, to not adequately thinking about it. Hence it is said, and he's quoting an ancient scholar, "You seek these qualities, and you shall find them. Neglect those qualities, and you shall lose them." Men differ widely, but it is only because they cannot fully utilize these natural powers. So this is a very profound idea, which was already the guiding principle at that time. They also had, Mencius especially, had a very keen sense that the state of society had a huge impact on the individual in society. So whereas individuals might think that they are completely of their own creation, their own opinions and so forth. I have my opinions. You hear that all the time. He understood that in many cases people were really defined by their society and by their culture. And also that, for instance, he said, In good years, the children of the people are most of them good, while in bad years, most of them abandon themselves to evil. It is not owing to any difference of their natural powers, conferred by heaven, that they are thus different. The abandonment of the good is owing to the circumstances through which they allow their minds to be ensnared and drowned in evil. So, there you have a sense of the culture, a very keen sense that you had to be mobilizing your population around these ideas. It wasn't just a matter of the king being benevolent, it's that you had to imbue in the population both a good economy to prevent this kind of decay and an aspiration to the good amongst all of the citizenry. Against this you had the legalists. Now the legalists, you probably heard the stories of the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, who united China in the 2nd century BC, and who created the first Chinese empire, the Qin Empire. You probably hear about him most because he built the wall, the famous wall. But this was a tyrant who based his ideas on the so-called legalists, who absolutely rejected this Confucian idea, and who viewed man the way Aristotle viewed man, as basically animals. Some people were born to rule, the rest were basically just some sort of a lower species who were to be treated as animals of some sort. And in fact, the wall was built by the fact that the Qin Shi Huang, sort of like the jails in England, the poverty jails, what did they call them? The poorhouse in England in the old days, where if you were poor, it was your fault. This is Calvinism, If you're poor, if you're rich, it's because God wanted you to be rich, and it proves that you're a righteous person. But if you're poor, it's your fault, and you are responsible, and you get thrown in jail in the poorhouse in England. And in ancient China under Qin Shi Huang, you didn't just get thrown in jail, you got sent out to build the wall. And when you died, your body became part of the mortar. There are thousands and thousands of bodies in that wall, which helped build it up, supposedly. So he's known as the great founder of the Chinese Empire. It actually was a period of decay and collapse, which was somewhat saved by the Han Dynasty, which took over in 200 after Christ. But in general, even under the Han Dynasty and then later a series of dynasties and the Tang Dynasty that you hear a lot about, which was at the end of the first millennium, which is a period where there was great poetry. This is the Silk Road time when there was beginning of great trade. But in general, it was a period of decay, and largely governed by Buddhist and Taoist thinking. The Confucian ideas had been largely repressed, and things were in a very sorry state by that time. I wanted to mention one other thing, because it'll come up later. Under the legalists, they also did away with what had emerged quickly after the time of Confucius, which was the examination system for government, in that in order to qualify as a local leader and then potentially later as a province leader or a national leader, you had to take very strict examinations that were examinations of virtue, not just of knowledge in the sense of memorization. But they were based on understanding these great texts of Confucius, the Great Learning, the Dashi, and the other great books. There's 4 great books, with Mencius becoming the 4th when he had done his writings. So these were done away with, and the argument was that, we should be able to choose teachers and government officials on merit, not on some artificial examination. But of course what that meant was that you were not requiring virtue as a quality, because being a scholar of the Confucian philosophy meant you were a scholar of virtue. And instead, merit, which would be based on whatever somebody wants to say who has merit and who doesn't. It's very much like what we have in the U.S., perhaps here too, the Obama policy of no child left behind is effectively breaking the educational system, dumping teachers whose students don't perform, usually because of poverty, like what I read to you about how in bad times people tend to be bad, and replacing them with cheap people with merit who take half the pay, and so forth. It's a general degrading of the educational system, and it's very similar to what went on there. So that's all I'm going to say about Confucius and Mencius. I want to focus mostly on the Sung Renaissance. And the figure I focused on and that Leibniz focused on was this guy Jushi. And Jushi, which is spelled Zhuxi, Jushi, was a great mind in the Sung Renaissance, the Sung period, which ended in 1200, or the 1200s, when the Mongols invaded and destroyed China. But that was the equivalent of their Renaissance. It was a few hundred years before the European Renaissance, but the thinking of Jushi and the thinking of people like Nicholas of Kuza were very much in sync. And that's what I began to look at. It was driven by the work that one of my co-defendants, Will Wirtz, was doing in another prison, translating Kuza. And Kuza had written a thing called In Pace Fidei. I think many of you have probably read that, or if you haven't, you should. It's a wonderful and fairly simple, in a sense, piece of Kuza's, unlike some of his writings. But it's a dialogue that Kuza holds with a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, a Tartar, and a few other religions. It's basically a dialogue of religions, where what he's trying to do is to show that the idea of the Trinity in Christianity, which Christians think of as the Father, God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or love, or agape, you might say, for the Holy Spirit. But Kuza said this is not just a religious notion to Christians, but rather it's based upon natural law and natural theology. It's based upon a conception which is truthful about the way the universe works and about the way man lives in the universe. And that any true religion, any religion which has succeeded in organizing a population to subsist and expand, must necessarily contain this conception. And he said it's better not to think of it as God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but to think of it in other terms. Like, for instance, the Creator, the creation, and the act of creation. The Creator, the created, and creation, the act of creation, which you could think of as creativity or again, agape. Or another way he talked about it was, let me read a section of this, was the unity of the Creator, the equality of that which is created with the Creator by the fact that every created thing reflects the quality of the Creator, and the connection, which is the connection between God, or the Creator, and the creation, is again this agape, or ren, or love. So what I was trying to do, since Kuza didn't know about Confucianism, was to show that this dialogue could have included Confucianism, and to effectively extend that concept into the Confucian theology, natural theology, you might say. And I, like Leibniz, was drawn towards Jushi, who was this brilliant character in the Sung dynasty. What he was up against was that during the Tang, the Chinese law from the time of Confucius had banned primogenitor. you know how to say that in Dutch? Primogenitor. The right of the first son of a family to inherit the property. And primogeniture tends to lead towards fondi. It tends to lead towards family dynasties, because the property essentially expands and expands, and the third and fourth generation don't have to do anything but inherit huge wealth, and you have the Rockefellers, and you have these great family dynasties. So they outlawed primogeniture, which had its values. What replaced it in the negative sense during the Tang, as is true in other cultures as well, is religious monasteries who accumulated land. And you had these big latifundistas, huge properties run by the Buddhist monasteries. And the Buddhist monasteries tended to become very much politically tyrannical, running these properties and treating the population more like slaves than like human beings. So he was up against this problem of Buddhism and of the Taoist problem. Taoism, I won't go into that, but I mean, it's by and large an animist view that rejects this concept of creator, creation, love, and so forth, and has instead a general, not too distinguished from the Buddhist view of all is one, sort of an undistinguished or undistinguishable. You can't distinguish between the human being and the rock. You know, they're sort of the same, and they treat the human mind in that sense as something which, as in Zen Buddhism, where the ideal is to stop thinking, to not use the creative powers of the mind. If you can empty your mind completely, then you reach nirvana. As a friend of mine once said, that sounds sort of like, nirvana sounds sort of like a computer when you pull the plug. Which I think was accurate. But, so like the Renaissance in Europe, Jushi's intent was to refute the Buddhist Taoist ideology, which had led to a degeneration of society, by reviving the ideas of Confucius and Mencius. And it was the revival of the Platonic tradition in Europe which really gave rise to the Renaissance. So there's a very straight parallel there, first of all. And before I talk about Jushi's sort of philosophic views and the comparison with Kuza and Leibniz, just mention that what they did in the Sung was just extraordinary. The Sung was the greatest period of just an explosion in China, of great culture, of science and technology. In agricultural especially, they began introducing hydraulic means of irrigation, developing machines for hydraulics, developing new seed strains, which vastly expanded the capacity to grow rice and other grains, introducing fertilizer in a scientific way. Yeah.
What year is this?
The 11th and 12th centuries. In the 1000s and the 1100s, especially in the 1100s. Jushi lived from 1130 to 1200. He died in 1200. And this, especially his work. He himself was an engineer who ran the public graineries as well as these public works projects. This agricultural expansion in particular is responsible for this incredible population boom that you had in China. They didn't expand the agricultural land very much because China is very limited. They have a lot of mountainous territory and stuff, and still true today. But they have incredible productivity of that land. The Chinese grow something in the range of 4 to 6 times more rice per hectare than places like Thailand, which is the largest rice producer in the world per capita. But it's not very productive. It's just a very rich land and so forth. The Chinese with small land. And this began in the Sung. They began developing the scientific technologies that made it possible for a rapid expansion of the population. And if you look at these maps, that's one map I could have used. We have some maps, a lot of them that we use in our publications, of world population over time that shows what happens in the European Renaissance when it goes, shroom, like this. But you'll notice a major bump before you get to the European Renaissance is right around this period. And that's all in China, because what's going on back in Europe is the Crusades, and the population is collapsing. And in the Arab world because of the Crusades. But China was just exploding. And this is, LaRouche has this term, which he calls the relative potential population density, as his measure of the truth of scientific discovery. How do you know that something you discover is true? Well, if you apply it to society and increases the potential population density relative to other areas, this relative potential population density, then it was true. It worked. And Leibniz very much had this idea. When he saw China, when he saw that they had huge cities, far, far larger than the cities in Europe, that they had more extensive educational policies for the population than anything that had been seen in Europe, especially before the Renaissance. Leibniz said that proves, very much according to LaRouche's view of this relative potential population density, this proves that they know the truth about human existence, about man's relationship to God and nature. And that therefore, when he began studying this, he began studying it with the perspective that he already knew from universal history that the Chinese knew what we knew in the Renaissance, and that therefore you have to find it. And rather than just sort of starting from the bottom up and saying, well, let's see what they think. I mean, he had that concept in mind. Just to finish the thought of what was going on in the Sung, they had shipbuilding. This was before there were hardly any ships, and remember those tiny little ships that Columbus sailed on, these little tiny ships. The Chinese were building what they called treasure ships that were about 6 or 8 times longer and bigger than these ships that Columbus sailed on, which were going through the Indian Ocean, into the Persian Gulf, up and down the Africa coast, doing diplomatic journeys, bringing diplomats back. This was actually later. Just briefly, you had this Sung Renaissance period up till about the 1240 or so, when the Mongols invaded and just destroyed China, and they ran China until about 1348, I think. But then when the next dynasty finally when the Muslims, the Mongols collapsed, you had the beginning of the Ming dynasty, and that was a resurrection of the policies of Jushi. I'll mention that a little bit later. But that was when the shipbuilding just really took off, and they were just all over the globe. If that had lasted a bit more, and I'll mention why it didn't, there's no question but that they would have decided to sail east, and that they would have discovered the New World long before Columbus did. But that got sabotaged. They were also the first country to have a paper currency. The government was guaranteeing that you could trade in this currency from any part of the country, so it became a means of expanding trade. They had iron industries, again, long before Europe. Silk industries that were producing the silk that was so treasured in the West, let alone throughout Asia. And as I said, huge cities. On the public works and on the public graineries, I'll read you a little bit on that. Wrong one. Here you go. And these, like I said, this is what Jushi himself was running, actually, the public graineries. What I was going to read on that, the public granaries were basically meant so that you wouldn't have periods of starvation. You had enough grain in storage so that in bad seasons you'd be able to meet it. But it wasn't just that. It was also, he said, that we had to prepare for emergencies in order to prevent the speculation, this is his quote, the speculation by the propertied gentleman who would stop selling grain in order to realize a profit. So, so he had an idea about usury and the hedge funds of their day. On the public works, this is Jushi's writing too. Recruiting hungry people to build waterworks and slightly increasing outside sums to be used for capital in beginning construction is to protect against disaster and to create new prosperity, like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The cost would be minimal, but the advantages would last forever. This is the infrastructure idea which LaRouche focuses on. What you're doing with basic infrastructure is increasing the productive power of labor. And it's that concept which underlay that policy. Then, to begin to sort of look at the philosophy of this, here's the relation to the economy. Jushi said this. He said, today the principle of the way, the Tao or the way, is lost. Can we unflaggingly cultivate ourselves and restore it? Is it possible for us to restore this in ourselves? This is why it is such an urgent matter. If we do not study, we will face an unnatural embankment, an unnatural obstacle. In normal times, we could perhaps barely get by, but when we're faced with a critical matter, there will be only confusion. In other words, this is a sense of the fact that if you allow decay, you're going to reach a crisis point like we are today in the world, in which if you don't implement these policies, you're simply going to have total collapse, as we're facing today with global depression and global war. So, as I mentioned, when the Ming came in after the Mongol hordes, they revived the Jushi's work in particular. The examinations, again, were based on Jushi's general revival of Confucianism. The capital was moved to the north, and the Grand Canal, you've all heard of the Grand Canal, was restored. And it was very much a development corridor, as we talk about today in the land bridge and the high-speed rail connections. They're not just to get from one place to the other, but they serve as a corridor for new cities, new developments, and so forth, and made it possible to move the grain from the south up to the north so that the capital could be moved to Beijing. So I think to understand the connection between Jushi and Kuza, you need to look at this from the top down, from the idea of universal history. If you don't, and I've written a great deal on this, which I won't discuss, you end up, if you look at it from the bottom up and you just look at various aspects of China, you end up with all kinds of wild theories and cults and so forth. I wrote one piece called I don't have it here, the European Enlightenment and the Chinese cults. You had people like Voltaire and Cuisne and others, Christian Wolff, who, after Leibniz's death, these various Venetian and British intelligence leaked types started a whole process of chinoiserie or something like that in French. Does somebody know the term? Sort of a cult of China, which was based actually on the Taoist and Buddhist ideologies, which had been overcome during the Sung dynasty by this Confucian culture. But if that's what happened, was because basically they were looking at it from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And you have to look at it from the top down, as Leibniz did. So look at, I'm going to review some of Jushi's philosophy. This might be dry, but I think it can be exciting if you think of it in terms of how parallel this is to the thinking that Kuza did, that gave rise to the European Renaissance. So, here's the way he defines Ren, first of all, this same term I mentioned before, Ren or Zhen. He said, the mind of heaven, the mind of God, you could say, the mind of heaven to produce things is Ren. In man's endowment, he receives this mind from heaven, and thus he can produce. In other words, you have the creative power to produce things, to change things. And therefore, man's feeling of commiseration with those, the poor and so forth, is also a principle of production. In other words, one loves one's love of mankind and concern for poverty and so forth is part of the productive process of the mind. They're the same. They're linked. He focuses on the fact that love, or that this idea of Ren, like agape, is a higher ordered thing than human love and compassion, which are the effect of this universal principle rather than its substance. And he says that you're not a person of Ren just because you're kind and benevolent. He said you can spread charity, but that's not Ren, and that's not the love of mankind as a whole. You can't just think, oh, I'm doing my bit. I gave some money to charity or something, and don't ask me to save the world. That doesn't make it. The quote here is, "Together with righteousness, propriety, and wisdom." No, that's not the quote. Sorry, that's me. "Human love and compassion are the effect of Ren, not its substance. Spreading charity widely to save the multitudes is not Ren, although Ren is the source of all morality and of all such moral deeds." Now, you might remember the Corinthians 1:13, the famous that ends with faith, hope, and charity. One part of that is, and I just jotted this down, and though I have given all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Somebody know that in Danish?
Yeah.
Off the top of their
I
head?
know it in English.
You know it in English too, yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's the same thing. And just like here, where
And in the Danish, they use the word for love, which is kærlighed.
caritas,
No.
or that word,
A
yeah,
similar word.
yeah.
Kærlighed.
And as I mentioned before, Ren is identified as the most central part of those four qualities of virtue. And also remember, at the end of that, it says faith, hope, and charity. But among these, charity, or agape, is the most important. And also that Ren itself is creativity. Well, actually, that's the one I just read to you a minute ago, that it's man's ability to produce, which is, in fact, that quality. Then Jushi added something to Confucianism, though, and it's sometimes called the school of principle, or the school of Li, L-I. There's many meanings for Li in different characters, but this character means principle. And he uses this, it's called the school of principle because he introduces this concept to overcome some of the problems that existed within the Confucian ideology in terms of Confucius and Mencius not addressing some fundamental existential questions about life. And because he was making profound scientific discoveries, as Kuza was when he developed his ideas. So what he says about this principle of Li, I'll read you a couple of these. He says, "Universal principle, or Li, is indeed complete wholeness. However, we call it principle in that it has a completely ordered pattern. Universal principle is simply a comprehensive term for the four virtues, Zhen, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom. And each of them is an individual enumeration for universal principle." So what he's getting at here is that you have a universal creative principle that's embedded in the universe. And we've talked a lot about Vernadsky, who talks about the fact that the universe is creative. Right? Even before man, before life, there was a process of self-development in the universe which demonstrates that the universe itself is creative. And a Christian might call this God and his creativity. But in any case, it's a creative process that's in and above the universe. Every aspect, every created thing in the universe reflects that creativity through its own particular principle, which is not the universal principle, but reflects that universal principle. And it's that concept of the universal Li, the individual Li, and the Ren, which is what I identified as the thing in keeping with this idea of the Trinity that Kuza was getting at. So think of that as I read you a couple of these quotes. Leibniz, when he saw this, identified this with his idea of the monad, where the universal principle of the universe he called the monad, but he saw that every created thing had in it its own undividable character, reflecting the universal, the microcosm and the macrocosm, as Kuza had called it. So Leibniz said this about the principle. The first principle of the Chinese is called Li, that is, reason, or the foundation of all nature, the most universal reason and substance. There is nothing greater nor better than Li. It is not at all capable of divisibility as regards its being, and is the principal basis of all the essences which are and which can exist in the world. So everything is created by this universal process and reflects that in some way, the way Leibniz's monad did. But this principle is also the aggregation of the most perfect multiplicity, in exactly the way I just said. In other words, it contains the total multiplicity of the created world. Skipping a little bit. The Chinese also attribute to this Li all manner of perfection, so perfect that there is nothing to add. One has said it all. Consequently, can we not say that the Li of the Chinese is the sovereign substance which we revere under the name of God? That comes from the discourse on the natural theology of the Chinese by Leibniz. Jushi himself said, principle is an all-encompassing wholeness which contains everything and which is contained in everything. He also said that the principle is unity, but the myriad things partake of it as their reality. Hence, each of the myriad things possesses it, Li. It possesses in it the great ultimate. So the God or the principle coexists in everything that is created. So you can get a sense
That's
why.
also in Christianity.
Exactly. That's exactly why Leibniz was saying
Yeah.
this is pure Christianity,
Yeah.
insofar as
I can understand that.
it is based on that idea that the truth is inscribed in our hearts. Leibniz, in his discourse on metaphysics, said, and this is sort of separate from his work on China, but in his discourse on metaphysics, he said, it can indeed be said that every substance bears in some sort the character of God's infinite wisdom and omnipotence, and imitates him as much as it is able to do. In other words, you try to live in the image of God, but that not even humans, everything, lives up to God as best it can. You know, a chlorophyll will try to be as creative as it can in producing plant life. Further, Kuza said that every created thing is, as it were, a finite infinite. It is finite in that it is bounded by its material form, but it is infinite precisely as its nature reflects God's creation. And this is very much like Einstein's conception of a universe, which is finite but bounded, unbounded, finite but unbounded. So, a sense, infinite in its multiplicity. So, next, and I'm doing this in obviously an extremely abbreviated way. This paper I wrote on this stuff is like very long. I had a lot of time to write when I had a 77-year prison sentence. So.
Thank God you didn't have to build a wall.
Yeah. I'll agree to that. But, and so I'm just sort of trying to encapsulate it as best I can, but I think you'll get the idea. In addition to all of that, what Jushi did that was so extraordinary and really gave rise to this Renaissance in China was that he actually made some fundamental changes in the original texts of the Confucius-Mencius school. Pretty bold thing to do. I mean, he wrote about why he was making these changes. And in some cases, just making a changed interpretation. But in some cases, he actually said, there was a missing part from this, and I've decided to fill it in. I'll read you that one. So, in particular, two things I'm going to do. One is from the Great Learning, the Dashua, which is one of the books of the Confucian texts. And one passage, a very important passage in the Dashua, is that the Tao, the way of greater learning. The Dashua is called greater learning. The way of greater learning. This is sort of like about how one should approach becoming a person of virtue. The way of greater learning lies in keeping one's inborn luminous virtue, the inborn luminous virtue, like that truth inscribed in our hearts that Leibniz talked about. So he refers to the inborn luminous virtue, to keep that unobscured. Don't let it get shaded. In renewing the people, that's the purpose, is renewing the people, and in coming to rest in perfect goodness. And that's the way Jushi wrote it. The original way it was always interpreted, and this is interpretation rather than the words themselves, was that the phrase keeping one's inborn luminous virtue unobscured was usually translated into the contemporary Chinese of the day as manifesting luminous virtue. That to be in the Great Learning, you had to manifest luminous virtue. Well, what's the difference? Well, the manifesting luminous virtue was essentially a call upon the leaders to manifest virtue in caring for the flock, for the people. Which was good, this is a good thing. But Jushi was emphasizing that this is not something that applies just to the leader. This is something that applies to every single member of the population. And the key is that everybody has this inborn luminous virtue. It's not just that you have to manifest it. It's that it's there, and you have to prevent it from being obscured or shadowed,
What was
And
his formulation?
his formulation was that the way of the Great Learning was to keep one's inborn luminous virtue unobscured. Don't lose it. It's sort of like before where he talked about in bad times people succumb to evil, you let it be obscured, but it's not because you don't have these qualities in your heart, it's that you don't use them. So this caused a lot of controversy, that he was changing what the previous great people had said. But it was the key thing. The other thing he did was actually added, was this where he did that? No, I don't have that right. Okay. I'm afraid I don't have in my head exactly how he went about this. I sort of forget it. But there's a famous passage from the same Dashua, the Great Learning, which it's sort of a chain of those in antiquity who wished all men throughout the empire to keep this is his formulation, to keep their inborn luminous virtue unobscured, put governing their states well first. Wishing to govern their states well, they first established harmony in their households. Wishing to establish harmony in their households, they cultivated themselves. Wishing to cultivate themselves, they set their minds on the right. Wishing to set their minds on the right, they first made their thoughts true. Wishing to make their thoughts true, they first extended their knowledge to the utmost. That's the sort of chain. And then it concludes, and I'm trying to remember this, I might not have this quite right, but it concludes in Jushi's formulation with the sentence, the extension of knowledge, which is the last thing, you're supposed to extend your knowledge, that's the final part of the chain. The extension of, that's right, he added this sentence, that's what it is. The extension of knowledge lies in fully apprehending the principle in things, or in anything. In other words, he's identifying the accumulation of knowledge as not the accumulation of facts or extensive learning, but rather in understanding from the top down everything. It's not being caught up by the shadows, as Plato says and as LaRouche says, not being caught up in what appears to your sense perception to be the way something looks or feels or touches or smells or something, but rather you have to find the principle in that thing which connects it to the universal. And that's true of people as well as material goods and so forth. So again, this was a pretty bold step that he made, and which was really the basis upon which the entire education system in China was fundamentally based right up until the revolution by Sun Yat-sen in 1811, or in 1911, excuse me. And at that point, he overthrew the education system, the examination system. But it was under Sun Yat-sen that he was, in fact, lifting it to a higher standard of a nation which functioned as a republic, where the population as a whole is mobilized around its education and its participation in a republican form of government, which had become possible and necessary in China by the time of Sun Yat-sen. There's a lot that could be said about Sun Yat-sen. I thought about whether I should talk about that today, but I won't. If you haven't, I'm sure Lainey comes through here and teaches Sun Yat-sen all the time, probably, right? Yeah. Lainey loves to talk about Sun Yat-sen, so I thought I could probably leave that. So, I'll leave it at that. I think you can see that this is very much focusing on Lin's and Helga's concept of the common aims of mankind, that this transformation, especially in the Song dynasty, was a time where China, like Europe in the Renaissance, were dealing with periods that had become dark ages and decay and collapse of civilization, and recognized that they had to intervene with science and with reason and with culture. And it was this kind of thinking that led to what I discussed on Saturday somewhat and in Frankfurt about the opening to the Jesuits when they arrived. When Matteo Ricci, who was the first Jesuit who arrived in China in 1560, I think, who came with the great Renaissance science instruments. He'd been trained by one of the close collaborators of Kepler. Before he came with the astrolabes and the things that had been developed by Renaissance science. He came with musical instruments and know how to create them, to produce them, to make them, and made violins and instruments for the Chinese. So this was, they were wide open to this. And just briefly, I'll say that when the Jesuits first arrived, they saw the Buddhists in their robes, and they thought, okay, these are the religious, and they began talking to them and working with them and assuming that these were the religious people. But then as they learned the culture a bit more and met the Confucian scholars and the government officials, they realized that they were the cultured people, and the Buddhists were effectively some sort of a mindless cult. That's perhaps being a little extreme. There were some smart Buddhists too. But by and large, they then quickly changed their allegiance and stopped wearing their long robes and started wearing the Confucian scholars' clothes, and very quickly became very close collaborators. By the next generation of Jesuits, actually the top advisors to the emperors. The greatest emperor of China during this period was one of the early. The Ming dynasty changed to the Qing dynasty, which was the Manchurians who sort of took over. And the first emperor there had his son become the personal student and ward almost of the Jesuit who was running the Jesuits' work in the court at the time. And this became the Kangxi emperor, who was this incredible, brilliant Renaissance leader in China, who led the collaboration, and then who was the one who was told by this papal bull I mentioned at the beginning that he had to, he and all of those who, he had actually just before that bull had issued a imperial statement saying that the Christians had full reign to organize throughout the realm, to recruit people to Christianity, to become teachers and university professors and so forth. So, this was wide open. And then, boom, the Jesuits, actually a bad Jesuit, a Jesuit who accused his fellow Jesuits of pandering to pantheism, went back along with a Franciscan and a Dominican and convinced the Pope to crush this without knowing anything. These guys didn't even know the Chinese characters. They were just ideologues working for the empire, for Venice. But anyway, let's leave it at that, and we'll see if there can be a discussion on philosophic history, or if you want to ask about other things like Maoism. You have